For most of human existence, our story is silent. No written language, no monuments carved in stone, no cities rising from the earth. Yet science tells us something remarkable. Modern humans, biologically identical to us, have existed for at least 300,000 years. They walked the same ground we walk today. They saw the same stars. They felt fear, curiosity, loss, and hope. And still, for the vast majority of that time, history says almost nothing. This silence is not a small gap. It is not a missing paragraph. It is a chasm. A stretch of time longer than all recorded history combined, longer than the age of pyramids, empires, religions, and nations put together. Why does the human story begin so late? Why did the first chapters of our existence appear to be missing? Mainstream history tells us that civilization began around 10,000 years ago, when humans settled, farmed, and built permanent communities. Writing followed. Records followed. History began. But humanity did not begin then. Long before the first cities, humans crossed continents, adapted to extreme climates, and survived a world far more dangerous than the one we know today. They endured ice ages, shifting seas, and environments that would challenge even modern technology. And yet, when we look back into that immense span of time, we find almost nothing. No cities buried beneath layers of sediment, no tools suggesting complex societies, no clear record of organized culture on a large scale. Just fragments, scattered stones, broken bones, faint traces of fire and movement. For generations, this silence was accepted without question. Early archaeologists assumed that prehistoric humans lived simple lives, leaving little behind. The absence of evidence was taken as proof of absence. But over time, that assumption began to weaken. As new discoveries emerged, the picture grew more complicated. Sites appeared that pushed back the timeline of human behavior. Tools, older than expected. Burials that suggested ritual. Artifacts that hinted at planning, cooperation, and memory. Still, none of it explained the silence. 300,000 years is a long time to forget. Consider how much humanity has changed in just the last 10,000 years. From stone tools to satellites, from villages to global civilization, from spoken myths to written laws. Now imagine compressing all of that progress into a fraction of our existence. What then filled the remaining time? Were early humans simply static, unchanging for hundreds of thousands of years? Did intelligence appear suddenly, as if switched on? Or are we missing something far more fundamental? Science does not claim to have all the answers. In fact, many researchers openly acknowledge that the earliest chapters of human history remain incomplete. The silence before history is not evidence of nothing. It is evidence of missing knowledge. And where knowledge is missing, questions begin to form. What if our understanding of the past is shaped less by what happened and more by what survived? What if entire worlds existed that left behind no obvious trace? And what if the silence itself is the clue? There is also a simpler possibility, one that can feel unsatisfying but cannot be ignored. Most of the ancient world is gone. Wind and water grind stone to dust. Forests reclaim clearings. Rivers change their course. And the sea over the last ice age rose by more than 100 meters, swallowing coastlines where early humans may have lived. If settlements once stood near the shore, they could now rest beneath deep water, buried under sand. And even on land, early humans may have built with what the world offered: wood, hides, fibers, bone, materials that vanish long before stone does. So the silence may be partly real and partly an illusion created by time. But that explanation raises its own question. If so much has been erased, how confident can we be that we have found the true beginning of civilization, rather than the first chapter that happened to survive? In the next part, we will look at what science does know about humanity before civilization, and why that knowledge only deepens the mystery. The more researchers study the deep past, the more uncomfortable the silence becomes, because silence is not neutral. In science, gaps are not empty spaces. They are questions waiting to be answered. And the gap before history is the largest question of all. For much of the 20th century, archaeologists assumed early humans changed slowly. Progress, they thought, was linear. Stone tools became slightly sharper. Hunting strategies improved bit by bit. Culture remained basic, repetitive, and small. Then the evidence began to shift. New discoveries revealed that early humans were capable of complex behavior far earlier than expected. Planning, cooperation, and problem-solving that required more than instinct. Some sites suggest repeated occupation, implying memory of place and deliberate return. Other findings point to care for the injured, which implies social bonds, responsibility, and perhaps even moral obligations within a group. These were not creatures merely surviving day to day. They were thinking beings. And yet, even as signs of intelligence appeared, something else remained missing. Scale. There were no unmistakable signs of large organized societies, no clear evidence of cities, long-distance trade networks, or monumental architecture on a civilizational level. Human groups appear scattered and light-footed, leaving behind only the smallest traces. This creates a tension that history rarely admits out loud. Is it truly reasonable to believe that a species capable of complex thought, cooperation, and long-term planning remained culturally static for hundreds of thousands of years? Or is it more reasonable to assume that much of what they created simply did not survive? History favors what lasts. Stone survives. Bone sometimes survives. Metal can survive under the right conditions. But wood rots. Textiles decay. Leather collapses into dust. Earthworks soften and flatten. And knowledge itself, if it isn't written, vanishes with the people who carried it. Early humans may have built with what the world offered: timber, reeds, hides, fiber, clay, packed earth. They may have shaped landscapes in subtle ways that later erosion erased. They may have lived close to rivers and coastlines that no longer exist in the same form today. Coastlines, in particular, matter more than most people realize. During the last ice age, sea levels were much lower. Vast stretches of land that are now underwater were once exposed. If humans settled there, where resources were abundant and travel was easy, then some of the most important evidence could now rest beneath the sea, buried under layers of sand and sediment, beyond the reach of casual archaeology. Even on land, the past is fragile. A campfire can vanish, a shelter can collapse, a village built from wood can disappear without leaving more than stains in the soil. So the silence may be partly real and partly an illusion created by time. But that explanation raises its own question. If so much has been erased, how confident can we be that we have found the true beginning of civilization, rather than the first chapter that happened to survive? This is why the start of history can be deceptive. History often begins not where humanity changed, but where humanity finally left marks that time could not easily destroy. And there is another possibility, one more unsettling. Some silences are not created by erosion, decay, or the ocean. Some are created by thresholds. Moments when the world changes so violently through climate shocks, ecological collapse, migration pressure, or population loss that the continuity of culture breaks. Skills are forgotten. Networks dissolve. Communities shrink. The next generations inherit not the full memory of the past, but only fragments. A reset does not need to be a single event, it can be a process. If such resets happened more than once, then the silence before history is not accidental. It is the shadow of repeated collapse, an ancient cycle of progress and loss that leaves only faint traces behind. In the next chapter, we will step beyond the silence and examine humanity before civilization, not as primitive figures at the dawn of progress, but as survivors in a world that did not yet belong to them. Before cities rose from the ground, humanity already belonged to the earth. Not as rulers, not as builders of empires, but as survivors. For most of our existence, humans lived in a world that was indifferent to them. Climate shifted without warning, predators dominated land and sky, food was uncertain, and shelter was temporary. There were no walls to hide behind, no farms to depend on, no written knowledge to preserve hard-earned lessons. And yet, humanity endured. That alone tells us something important. Survival on this scale does not happen by accident. Early humans were not passive creatures drifting through time. They were active participants in a dangerous environment, constantly adapting, learning, and responding to threats. Their lives demanded awareness, memory, and cooperation. One person alone was vulnerable. A group, coordinated and alert, had a chance. To live through an ice age is not simply a matter of suffering and enduring. It requires understanding seasonal change, animal behavior, geography, and risk. It requires anticipating where herds will move, where water will remain, where shelter can be found when temperatures drop suddenly. It requires planning beyond the present moment. And planning requires intelligence. Long before civilization, humans mastered fire, not just as warmth, but as protection, as a tool, and as a social center. Fire extended the day into the night. It reshaped diet. It altered the balance between humans and predators. A controlled flame could keep danger at the edge of darkness. It could turn raw food into energy that the body could absorb more efficiently. It could harden wood, shape stone, and strengthen a point meant for hunting. Control of fire alone marks a profound shift in how humans interacted with the world. But fire was only the beginning. Tools became more specialized over time. Not all stone tools were meant for the same task. Some were shaped for cutting meat, others for working wood, others for scraping hides, preparing clothing, or shaping bone. That level of specialization suggests foresight and teaching. Knowledge had to be passed down. Mistakes had to be corrected. Skills had to be practiced. In other words, culture already existed. It simply did not take the form we later came to recognize. Human groups were small, mobile, and deeply connected to their environment. They followed animals, water, and seasonal plants. Movement was not a weakness, it was a strategy. To stay in one place too long could mean starvation or death. In a world where conditions could shift quickly, permanence was a liability. Civilization, as we define it today, values accumulation. Buildings, stored food, fixed territory. But for most of human history, accumulation would have slowed survival. Everything unnecessary was a burden. What could not be carried might be lost. What could not be protected might be stolen. And what could not be replaced might mean death. This may be part of why early humanity left so little behind. They were not building for eternity. They were building for tomorrow. Archaeology often looks for permanence. Stone foundations, walls, dense layers of debris, long occupation in the same place. But early humans may have lived lightly, leaving behind only what was essential. Their shelters may have been temporary. Their tools may have been reused, reshaped, or carried away. Their camps may have been seasonal, occupied, abandoned, and then reclaimed by nature. The absence of ruins does not mean the absence of life. It may simply mean a different way of living, one that leaves fewer scars on the landscape. And this raises an uncomfortable possibility. What we call civilization may not represent the beginning of intelligence or culture. It may represent the moment when humanity chose stability over mobility, when the world became predictable enough to settle and fragile enough to demand protection. Before that moment, humanity existed in a different mode, not building monuments, not recording history, but learning the world in ways we are only beginning to understand. In the next part, we will step into that world more directly, a world where humans were not the dominant species, but one among many, surviving within an ecosystem that could hunt them, starve them, and erase their traces with time. To understand humanity before civilization, we must abandon the idea that intelligence automatically leads to cities. For most of our existence, intelligence led somewhere else. It led to awareness. Early humans lived in a world where danger did not announce itself politely. Predators did not wait. Weather did not negotiate. A single mistake, choosing the wrong path, misjudging a season, trusting the wrong moment, could mean death. Survival demanded constant attention. This kind of awareness shapes the mind differently than life inside walls. Modern humans are surrounded by buffers, technology, infrastructure, stored food, medical systems. Early humans had none of these. Their intelligence was not abstract. It was immediate, practical, and deeply tied to the natural world. They learned to read landscapes the way we read text. They recognized subtle signs of animal movement. They sensed changes in wind, temperature, and sound. This knowledge was not written down. It lived in memory, experience, and teaching. Children did not learn in classrooms. They learned by watching, imitating, and participating. Skills were passed from generation to generation through demonstration and repetition. Mistakes were corrected not by instruction manuals, but by consequence. In such a system, knowledge was fragile. If a group was lost, its knowledge could vanish with it. This may explain why the deep past feels so empty, not because nothing existed, but because what existed depended entirely on living people to survive. And people did not always survive. Population numbers during much of prehistory were likely very low compared to today. Small groups spread across vast territories. If climate shifted or resources failed, entire communities could disappear without leaving more than faint traces. No collapse would be recorded. No ending would be remembered. Only silence. This is a crucial point that modern perspectives often miss. We tend to imagine progress as cumulative, each generation building on the last, knowledge steadily increasing. But in a fragile world, progress can be interrupted. Skills can be lost. Traditions can fade. Entire ways of life can vanish if conditions change too quickly. Civilization assumes continuity. Prehistory did not guarantee it. Before agriculture, before permanent settlement, human life was flexible but vulnerable. Adaptation allowed survival, but it did not protect memory. Without writing, without durable structures, without stable populations, the past could disappear as easily as it formed. This does not mean early humanity was inferior. It means it existed under different rules. Rules where intelligence served survival, not expansion. Rules where culture was lived, not recorded. Rules where the future mattered more than preserving the past. And yet, despite this fragility, humanity endured long enough to reach a turning point. At some moment, different in different places, humans began to settle. They stayed when seasons changed. They planted rather than followed. They stored food rather than consuming it immediately. They accepted risk in exchange for stability. Civilization was not inevitable. It was a choice shaped by circumstance. And once that choice was made, everything changed. Memory became external. Knowledge became durable. History began to accumulate. But what came before did not disappear because it lacked intelligence. It disappeared because it was not designed to last. Understanding this forces us to reconsider the silence before history. It may not mark the absence of humanity's story, but the end of a way of life that left few marks behind. And if that is true, then the forgotten age of humanity is not a void. It is a foundation, hidden beneath the surface of everything that came after. In the next chapter, we will explore the world that shaped this way of life more closely. A world where humans were not the dominant force, but prey as often as predator, surviving among giants in a landscape that showed no mercy. For much of prehistory, the world did not belong to humans. It belonged to giants. Long before cities, before borders, before civilization itself, the earth was dominated by creatures far larger, stronger, and more specialized than we are today. Massive predators ruled the land. Powerful hunters controlled the skies. The oceans teemed with life capable of killing without effort. In this world, humans were not masters. They were vulnerable. To understand early humanity, we must let go of the modern assumption that intelligence equals dominance. Intelligence did not place humans at the top of the food chain. It merely gave them a chance to survive. The prehistoric landscape was filled with danger. Large cats hunted in silence. Bears claimed territory without warning. Packs of predators worked together, testing weakness and patience. Even the skies were not safe. Birds of prey, large enough to target small animals and possibly children, once existed in parts of the world. Early humans lived with constant awareness of death. They did not wake to safety, they woke to risk. Every journey carried uncertainty. Every sound could signal danger. Survival depended on reading the environment with precision. A snapped branch, a sudden silence, the wrong wind direction. In such a world, fear was not weakness, it was information. Human senses evolved not for comfort, but for detection. Peripheral vision, sensitivity to sound, the ability to recognize patterns in movement and behavior. These traits were not accidents. They were shaped by generations that did not survive long enough to make mistakes twice. Children learned early. The group learned together. And memory, shared memory, became essential. Stories were not entertainment. They were warnings. Rituals were not superstition. They were reminders. Where danger lived, when it came, how to respond. The absence of written language did not mean the absence of knowledge. It meant that knowledge had to live inside people, and that made it fragile. If a group was wiped out, its understanding of the world vanished with it. This is a crucial difference between prehistoric life and civilization. Civilization externalizes memory. Prehistory internalized it. And internal memory can be erased by violence, disease, or environmental collapse. The animals that shared the world with early humans were not static. Many were specialists, adapted to specific niches, equipped with claws, teeth, speed, or sheer size that humans could not match. Humans did not defeat them through strength. They avoided them. They learned their habits. They respected their territory. Survival was not about conquest. It was about restraint. This relationship shaped human behavior in subtle ways. Early humans likely traveled quietly. They chose campsites carefully. Fire was controlled not only for warmth but for defense, its light pushing predators back into the darkness. Even then, fire could not be used carelessly. Smoke revealed location. Flame consumed resources. Everything involved trade-offs. Living as prey forces intelligence to focus on the present moment. Long-term planning exists, but it is grounded in immediate reality. There is little room for abstraction when survival depends on constant vigilance. This may be why prehistoric humanity appears so different from later civilizations. They were not building upward. They were building inward, sharpening awareness, strengthening bonds, learning when to move and when to stay. And yet, despite this danger-filled existence, humans did more than survive. They spread. They crossed mountains, deserts, forests, and ice. They reached places no predator had followed before. They adapted, not by overpowering the world, but by understanding it. That understanding, however, came at a cost. A world that treats humans as prey does not preserve their traces. It erases them. In the next part, we will examine how this constant pressure shaped human behavior and why living in such a world makes the silence before history not only understandable, but inevitable. Living in a world where humans were prey did more than shape behavior. It shaped psychology. Fear in prehistory was not a disorder to be managed. It was a survival tool, finely tuned and constantly active. A lack of fear did not signal courage, it signaled danger. Those who failed to recognize threats rarely lived long enough to pass on their traits. This constant pressure created a form of intelligence that modern society rarely experiences. Attention was survival. Distraction was death. Early humans could not afford to separate themselves from their surroundings. The landscape was not background scenery. It was an active system filled with signals. Tracks in mud, broken foliage, shifts in animal behavior, subtle changes in sound or smell. To miss these signs was to risk everything. This kind of awareness leaves little room for excess. Early humans likely carried few possessions because carrying too much slowed movement. They learned when to abandon resources, when to retreat, and when to stand together. Cooperation was not a moral ideal, it was a practical necessity. A single human was weak. A group was alert. This explains why social bonds formed so early in our species. Groups provided more eyes, more ears, and more memory. Knowledge was shared because survival depended on it. A child who learned danger too late endangered everyone. In such conditions, hierarchy mattered less than competence. Those who could read the land, anticipate threats, or respond quickly earned influence, not through authority, but through usefulness. Leadership may have been fluid, shifting depending on circumstance. The best hunter led the hunt. The most experienced elder guided migration. The most alert individual warned of danger. This flexible structure does not leave obvious archaeological signatures. There are no palaces for temporary leaders, no inscriptions for situational authority. Power did not accumulate long enough to fossilize. This may be another reason the deep past appears empty. The world early humans inhabited was also unstable. Climate fluctuated dramatically over thousands of years. Ice advanced and retreated. Forests turned to grasslands. Coastlines shifted. Animals migrated or vanished. Each change forced humans to adapt again, and adaptation is not gentle. When environments change too quickly, knowledge becomes obsolete. Migration routes no longer work. Hunting strategies fail. Familiar plants disappear. A group that once thrived can collapse within a generation. When that happens, there is no record of failure, only absence. This cycle of pressure, adaptation, and loss may have repeated many times across the forgotten age of humanity. Each cycle reshaped behavior, culture, and memory. Each collapse erased part of what came before. Over time, the result would look exactly like what we see today. A long silence. Not because nothing happened, but because survival left no monuments. Understanding this reframes the way we look at early humanity. Instead of asking why they did not build civilization sooner, we must ask whether civilization was even possible under such conditions. Stability is a requirement for permanence. Without predictable seasons, reliable resources, and manageable threats, long-term settlement is a risk few would take. Civilization does not emerge from danger alone. It emerges when danger becomes manageable. For most of prehistory, danger was constant. Humans were prey not only to animals but to the environment itself. And yet, within this harsh reality, something remarkable was forming. Shared memory, collective learning, cultural patterns that existed only as long as people remembered them. These invisible systems kept humanity alive through conditions that should have wiped it out. But invisibility comes at a cost. When the pressure eased, when predators vanished, climate stabilized, and humans began to settle, the old ways no longer fit the new world. What survived was not the full memory of prehistory, but fragments adapted to a different mode of life. The silence before history may therefore be the echo of a world where humanity learned to survive by disappearing. In the next chapter, we will turn to the most unsettling aspect of this forgotten age, the evidence that suggests not just survival, but intelligence and behavior that appear too early in the human timeline to fit comfortably within conventional history. For a long time, the silence before history seemed complete. Then cracks began to appear. They did not arrive all at once, and they did not announce themselves loudly. Instead, they surfaced quietly, through discoveries that felt out of place, uncomfortable, and difficult to explain. Evidence that did not belong where it was found. Archaeology is built on expectation. Layers of soil correspond to time. Deeper means older. Simpler tools appear before complex ones. Behavior evolves gradually. When something breaks that pattern, it creates tension, and tension makes people uneasy. Across different regions of the world, archaeologists began uncovering signs of human behavior that seemed too advanced for their age. Tools appeared earlier than expected. Burials suggested symbolic thinking long before writing or cities. Objects hinted at planning, intention, and memory where none should have existed. Each discovery on its own could be dismissed, an anomaly, a misinterpretation, an error in dating. But taken together, they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. Consider the timeline. Modern humans existed hundreds of thousands of years ago. For much of that time, the official story tells us their lives were simple. Yet evidence increasingly suggests that simplicity may be an illusion created by survival bias. Only certain kinds of objects last long enough to be found. Stone tools dominate the record not because stone defined early life, but because stone survives. What does not survive is just as important. Wooden structures, fiber tools, early containers, symbolic objects made from organic materials. If early humans expressed intelligence through materials that decay, then archaeology would see only shadows. And yet, even within the surviving record, things appear that raise questions. At several sites, tools have been discovered that required multiple steps to produce. This implies not only skill, but teaching. Knowledge had to be transferred accurately from one person to another. Mistakes had to be recognized and corrected. This is not trial and error behavior. It is structured learning. Elsewhere, evidence of controlled fire use appears far earlier than once believed. Not sporadic flames, but repeated, deliberate use over long periods. Fire changes everything. It reshapes diet, social structure, and daily rhythm. It extends waking hours and creates shared space. It is a technology, not a coincidence. Then there are burials. Some of the earliest known human burials suggest care for the dead. Bodies placed deliberately, objects arranged nearby, positions chosen with intention. These acts serve no immediate survival purpose, they serve meaning. Symbolic behavior implies an awareness of time, past, present, and future. It implies memory, identity, and perhaps belief. These are not traits of a species on the edge of awareness. They are traits of a mind already looking beyond survival. And yet, mainstream history often treats these findings cautiously, even reluctantly, not because they are false, but because they are incomplete. A single tool does not define a culture. A burial does not define a civilization. Without broader context, settlements, infrastructure, written records, such discoveries remain isolated. They suggest something, but they do not confirm it. and so they exist in an uncomfortable space. Too significant to ignore, too fragmentary to explain fully. This is where the silence becomes deceptive. We expect evidence of intelligence to look like cities, monuments, and machines. When it does not, we assume it was not there. But intelligence adapts to conditions. In a world hostile to permanence, intelligence may avoid leaving traces. It may express itself through movement rather than construction, through memory rather than inscription, through behavior rather than architecture. If so, then what we call advanced may have existed long before we were prepared to recognize it. The problem is not that the evidence does not exist. The problem is that it does not exist in the form we expect. And this raises a difficult question. How much of humanity's early intelligence has gone unrecognized? Not because it wasn't real, but because it did not resemble the civilizations that came later. In the next part, we will look more closely at the most controversial discoveries of all, those that challenge not just the timeline, but the very assumptions on which modern history is built. Some discoveries are not controversial because they are extraordinary. They are controversial because they do not fit. Throughout the last century, archaeologists have encountered evidence that sits uncomfortably within the established timeline of human history. These findings do not announce a lost civilization outright. Instead, they whisper that something about the past is incomplete. Consider how science normally works. When evidence fits expectations, it strengthens a theory. When it does not, it is examined carefully, tested repeatedly, and often set aside until more context is available. This is not dishonesty, it is caution. But caution has consequences. Findings that challenge existing frameworks tend to remain isolated. They are published quietly, debated narrowly, and rarely integrated into the broader narrative. Over time, they become footnotes rather than foundations. Yet patterns do not disappear simply because they are inconvenient. In multiple locations, human artifacts have been found in geological layers that suggest far greater age than once believed possible. Some tools show levels of refinement that imply repeated practice, not accidental discovery. Others suggest adaptation to local environments that would have required long-term familiarity. These are not random actions. They are learned behaviors. Then there are remains of early humans who survived injuries that should have been fatal, healed fractures, long-term disabilities, signs that individuals were cared for despite being unable to hunt or gather effectively. Care requires planning. Planning requires surplus. Surplus requires organization. Such behavior hints at social structures that go beyond immediate survival, and yet these structures leave little physical trace. Unlike cities or monuments, care does not fossilize. Cooperation does not erode into stone. Teaching leaves no walls behind. The more we rely on physical remnants alone, the more we risk misunderstanding societies that prioritized people over permanence. This is one of the great limitations of archaeology. It is biased toward what endures. If early humanity expressed intelligence through systems that relied on memory, oral transmission, and flexible social organization, then much of that intelligence would vanish without a trace when populations declined or environments shifted. And environments did shift, repeatedly. Ice ages advanced and retreated. Sea levels rose and fell. Landscapes transformed. Entire ecosystems collapsed and reformed. Each change disrupted human groups, sometimes forcing migration, sometimes causing extinction. With each disruption, knowledge could be lost. Not erased deliberately, but broken, fragmented into pieces that later generations could not fully reassemble. This process does not require a single catastrophe. It only requires instability. A drought here, a cold snap there, a predator expansion, a disease. Over tens of thousands of years, even small disruptions compound. The result would look exactly like what we observe today. A timeline where intelligence appears in flashes, capabilities surface, then vanish. Progress seems to restart again and again. From this perspective, the evidence that shouldn't exist is not evidence of impossibility. It is evidence of discontinuity. Human history may not be a smooth upward curve. It may be a series of rises and collapses, advances and losses, remembered only in fragments. If this is true, then what we consider the beginning of civilization may not be the first time humans became capable of complex thought or organization. It may simply be the first time those capabilities survived long enough to accumulate. This possibility changes how we interpret every discovery. Instead of asking whether early humans were capable of complexity, we must ask why complexity did not last. And that question leads us inevitably toward a darker subject. If knowledge and culture were lost repeatedly, then something must have erased them. In the next chapter, we will confront that possibility directly by examining the idea of global resets, population bottlenecks, and catastrophic events that may have wiped away entire chapters of the human story. At some point, the evidence forces an uncomfortable conclusion. Human intelligence did not appear suddenly with civilization. It was already there. Long before writing, long before cities, long before agriculture reshaped the landscape, humans were thinking in ways that challenge our assumptions about the past. They planned, they taught, they remembered, and they adapted with a level of sophistication that cannot be explained by instinct alone. This is where the timeline begins to strain. Modern humans possess brains that are, in size and structure, essentially identical to ours today. Fossil evidence confirms that this anatomy existed hundreds of thousands of years ago. The hardware was already in place. The question is not whether early humans could think. The question is how much they were capable of, and why so little of it remains visible. Intelligence does not require civilization to exist. It requires challenges that demand problem-solving. Prehistory offered no shortage of those challenges. Survival in an unstable world pushed the human mind toward flexibility, creativity, and foresight. Evidence of this appears in places we do not always recognize. Consider tool-making. Some early tools were not simple objects struck from stone at random. They required multiple stages of production. Raw material had to be selected, transported, shaped, and refined. Certain techniques demanded precise angles and controlled force. Errors ruined the tool. Success required experience. This implies learning curves. It implies instruction. And instruction implies a shared understanding of cause and effect, an ability to anticipate results before they occur. Beyond tools, there is evidence of spatial awareness that goes far beyond wandering. Early humans navigated vast territories with remarkable accuracy. They returned to specific locations season after season. They crossed natural barriers, mountain ranges, deserts, bodies of water that required planning and coordination. Such movement is not accidental. It suggests mental maps passed through generations. Then there is timing. Hunting strategies depended on understanding animal behavior over long periods, knowing when herds would migrate, when certain prey would be vulnerable, when seasons would change. This required memory and prediction, two core components of intelligence. And yet, despite all this, history often treats early humans as if they were waiting for civilization to unlock their potential. That assumption may be backward. Civilization did not create intelligence. Intelligence created civilization. But intelligence does not always express itself in permanent structures. In a world defined by uncertainty, intelligence often favors flexibility over fixation. Why build something that cannot move when survival depends on adaptation? Why accumulate possessions when excess becomes a liability? Why leave marks that attract danger? In such conditions, intelligence may choose invisibility. This creates a paradox for modern observers. We look for proof of intelligence in what lasts, buildings, machines, written language. When we do not find those things, we assume intelligence was absent. But intelligence is not measured by permanence. It is measured by success. And early humanity succeeded where many species failed. They survived repeated climate shifts. They adapted to radically different environments. They spread across nearly every habitable region of the planet. This level of success suggests not just intelligence, but resilience. And resilience often hides itself. It leaves no monuments, no inscriptions, no declarations of achievement. Only survival. The problem is that survival does not impress the archaeological record. When knowledge is carried in minds rather than objects, it vanishes when those minds are gone. When teaching occurs through practice rather than symbols, it leaves no trace. When intelligence adapts moment by moment, it resists fossilization. This may be why the past feels so empty, not because intelligence was absent, but because it was expressed in ways that time could not preserve. And yet, intelligence does leave echoes in patterns of behavior, in repeated choices across distant regions, in similarities that emerge without direct contact. These echoes suggest that early humanity may have shared ways of thinking far earlier than we assume. If that is true, then intelligence did not slowly awaken at the dawn of civilization. It was already awake, waiting for conditions that allowed it to leave a lasting mark. In the next part, we will explore what happens when intelligence meets catastrophe, and how repeated disruptions may have erased entire chapters of human capability from the historical record. When intelligence exists without permanence, it becomes vulnerable to forces beyond its control. This is the uncomfortable reality of early human history. For tens of thousands of years, human intelligence may have advanced not in a straight line, but in fragile bursts, periods of learning followed by loss. Knowledge accumulated slowly, passed from person to person, generation to generation, without written records or durable storage. In such a system, continuity was never guaranteed. A single disaster could undo centuries of learning. Imagine a small population that has mastered its environment. They understand local animals, seasonal cycles, safe routes, and sources of food. Their intelligence is practical, refined, and effective. Now imagine that environment collapses. A rapid climate shift alters rainfall. A prolonged drought eliminates key resources. A sudden cold period reshapes the landscape. Or a new predator enters the region, changing the balance of survival. Within a few generations, or even a few years, that accumulated knowledge becomes useless. Migration follows. Population declines. Social networks fracture. When the last individuals who carried that knowledge die, the intelligence does not disappear because it was false. It disappears because it was never recorded. This process does not need to happen once. It can happen repeatedly. Over deep time, humanity may have experienced multiple cycles of adaptation and collapse. Each cycle would refine intelligence, and each collapse would erase much of what had been learned. The archaeological record would capture only fragments, the brief moments when conditions allowed knowledge to stabilize. From our perspective, this would look like intelligence appearing too early, then vanishing. Tools become sophisticated, then simpler again. Behaviors emerge, then fade. Capabilities surface, then seem to restart later. This pattern is deeply unsettling because it challenges one of our most comfortable assumptions, that progress is permanent. Modern civilization is built on the idea that knowledge accumulates. Libraries, digital storage, institutions all exist to prevent loss. We assume that once something is learned, it will remain available. Prehistoric humanity did not have that luxury. Its intelligence lived in motion. It moved with people. It survived only as long as people survived. When people were lost, intelligence was lost with them. This reframes the question of advanced behavior in the deep past. Instead of asking why early humans did not build civilizations, we must ask whether civilization was even compatible with their world. Civilization requires stability. Stability requires predictability. For much of prehistory, the world offered neither. Under such conditions, intelligence may have focused on resilience rather than expansion, on adaptability rather than accumulation, on survival rather than legacy. This kind of intelligence does not announce itself across millennia. It vanishes quietly. And yet, hints remain. Similar patterns of behavior emerge in distant regions without obvious contact. Comparable tools appear across continents. Shared approaches to survival develop independently, suggesting that human minds, faced with similar challenges, reached similar solutions. This is intelligence expressing itself universally, not locally. It suggests that early humanity was not intellectually isolated. The human mind itself was the common factor, a shared capacity shaped by experience, not by culture alone. If intelligence was already well developed long before civilization, then the emergence of civilization represents not the birth of intelligence, but a shift in how intelligence was expressed. It marks the moment when the world became stable enough for knowledge to settle. But stability is rare in deep time, and when stability breaks, intelligence once again becomes vulnerable. This raises a profound implication. What we call lost knowledge may not belong to a single lost civilization. It may belong to many forgotten populations, each intelligent, each adaptive, each erased by circumstances beyond their control. The forgotten age of humanity may not be defined by one great rise and fall. It may be defined by repetition, learning, losing, learning again. If that is true, then intelligence did not appear too early. It appeared as early as it could and struggled to survive in a world that did not yet allow it to endure. In the next chapter, we will confront the forces capable of erasing intelligence on a global scale. Catastrophic events, population bottlenecks, and the possibility that human history has been reset more than once. At some point, the question can no longer be avoided. If human intelligence existed early, if knowledge developed and disappeared repeatedly, then something must have been capable of erasing it, again and again. This is where the idea of a reset enters the story. Not as a single dramatic event, but as a pattern written into deep time. The Earth is not a stable stage on which history quietly unfolds. It is a dynamic system, shaped by forces far larger than any human society. Climate shifts, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, tectonic movements, and sudden changes in ocean circulation have repeatedly transformed the planet. To modern civilization, such events feel hypothetical. To prehistoric humanity, they were lived reality. One of the most significant forces shaping early human history was climate instability. Over the last several 100,000 years, the planet has moved through multiple ice ages and interglacial periods. Temperatures rose and fell dramatically. Ice sheets advanced, then retreated. Sea levels dropped, then surged. Each shift redrew the map of the world. Land bridges appeared and vanished. Habitats expanded, then collapsed. Animals migrated or went extinct. Human populations were forced to respond. Sometimes they adapted, sometimes they moved, sometimes they disappeared. Genetic evidence tells part of this story. Studies of human DNA suggest that our species passed through severe population bottlenecks, periods when numbers dropped so low that survival itself was uncertain. These were not localized events. They affected humanity on a global scale. When populations collapse, knowledge collapses with them. Skills that require many people to maintain disappear first. Complex social structures fracture. Long-distance connections vanish. What remains is whatever knowledge can be carried by a few survivors. A reset does not need to wipe out everyone. It only needs to reduce humanity to a fraction of itself. From that fraction, history must begin again. Consider what happens when a world changes faster than culture can adapt. Agricultural systems fail. Familiar animals vanish. Seasonal patterns shift beyond recognition. Routes that once led to safety lead instead to starvation. Under such conditions, even intelligent societies can unravel. Prehistoric humanity did not have the buffers that modern civilization relies on. There were no global networks to share information, no stored reserves to draw upon, no institutions to preserve knowledge during crisis. When disaster struck, it struck directly. The archaeological record hints at these disruptions. Layers of abandonment, sudden changes in tool styles, gaps where populations once existed. These are not always dramatic enough to be called catastrophes, but together they suggest repeated breaks in continuity. What came before did not smoothly transition into what came after. It ended, and something new emerged in its place. This is why the deep past feels fragmented, not because humanity lacked history, but because history itself was broken into pieces by forces beyond human control. The idea of a great reset does not require a single apocalyptic event. It can emerge naturally from repeated environmental stress, migration, and collapse. Over thousands of years, these pressures could erase entire ways of life without leaving clear evidence behind. From our perspective, this would look like a mystery. Intelligence appears early, then disappears, then reappears later in a different form. But from the perspective of those who lived through it, there would be no mystery at all, only survival. And survival leaves little time for memory. The possibility of repeated resets forces us to rethink the narrative of progress. Instead of a steady ascent from ignorance to knowledge, human history may be marked by cycles of learning and loss, each shaped by the limits imposed by the natural world. If that is true, then civilization is not the inevitable outcome of intelligence. It is the fragile exception. In the next part, we will examine the most dramatic forces capable of triggering such resets, events that did not merely challenge humanity, but nearly erased it from the planet entirely. Some resets leave scars that are difficult to erase, not in memory, but in the planet itself. Throughout Earth's history, there have been moments when change was not gradual, but abrupt. Climate shifted not over millennia, but within centuries, sometimes even decades. Environments that once supported life became hostile almost overnight. For small, scattered human populations, such changes were devastating. One of the most powerful forces behind these disruptions was the end of the last ice age. As temperatures rose, ice sheets melted at an accelerating pace. Sea levels climbed rapidly, swallowing coastlines that had existed for tens of thousands of years. Entire landscapes vanished beneath the ocean. If early humans lived near these coasts, as many hunter-gatherers likely did, then their homes, camps, and travel routes were erased completely. Not destroyed, buried. The rising sea did not preserve history. It concealed it. At the same time, melting ice altered global weather patterns. Rainfall shifted. Deserts expanded. Forests retreated. Animals that humans depended on migrated or disappeared. Familiar survival strategies no longer worked. For groups that could not adapt quickly enough, collapse followed. Inland, other forces were at work. Volcanic eruptions injected ash into the atmosphere, lowering temperatures and poisoning ecosystems. Long winters followed sudden eruptions, reducing plant growth and animal populations. Even a single major eruption could disrupt life across entire regions. Then there were impacts from space. While rare, asteroid and comet strikes have reshaped the planet before. Even smaller impacts can trigger massive environmental consequences: fires, cooling, and ecological collapse. For early humanity, such events would not be remembered as disasters. They would be remembered as the end of the world. And yet, humanity survived. But survival came at a cost. Population bottlenecks reduced diversity, not just genetically, but culturally. When only a few thousand or even a few hundred individuals remain, the range of skills and knowledge narrows dramatically. Specialized abilities vanish first. What remains is whatever knowledge is essential to immediate survival. Everything else is lost. This means that resets do not merely reduce numbers, they simplify humanity. Each reset strips away complexity. It leaves behind a more basic version of society, still intelligent, still capable, but less connected to what came before. From the outside, this looks like regression. From the inside, it is adaptation. Archaeological evidence reflects this pattern. Periods of relative sophistication are followed by simpler toolkits. Settlement patterns shift abruptly. Long-distance connections disappear, then slowly re-emerge thousands of years later. These are not signs of failure. They are signs of interruption. The great mistake of modern interpretation is assuming that history must always move forward, that knowledge once gained must be preserved, that intelligence once expressed must accumulate. Nature does not operate that way. Nature resets systems that grow too complex for their environment. If early humanity developed knowledge and behaviors that depended on stable conditions, those systems would be the first to fail when conditions changed. What survived would be what could function under pressure. This helps explain why civilization emerged only after the planet entered a relatively stable climatic period. Agriculture, permanent settlement, and long-term planning require predictability. Without it, they are liabilities. Civilization did not arise because humans suddenly became smarter. It arose because the world finally became calm enough to allow intelligence to settle. But calm periods do not last forever. If the past teaches us anything, it is that stability is temporary. The forgotten age of humanity may therefore be defined not by a single lost golden age, but by many interrupted attempts, each shaped by intelligence, each erased by circumstance. From this perspective, the Great Reset is not a myth. It is a recurring feature of human history. And if resets have shaped our past, then their echoes may still be present today, in myths, memories, and stories passed down from worlds that no longer exist. In the next chapter, we will explore those echoes by examining the idea of survivors, those who may have carried fragments of lost knowledge across the resets, preserving memory in forms that history struggles to recognize. Not every reset ends in total silence. Even the most devastating collapses leave survivors. They are few, they are scattered, and they rarely carry the full memory of what was lost. But they carry something. Throughout human history, survival has never been evenly distributed. When catastrophe strikes, some regions are spared while others are destroyed. Some groups adapt while others vanish. Some knowledge survives, not because it is superior, but because it remains useful under new conditions. This uneven survival creates an important possibility. If humanity experienced repeated resets, then fragments of earlier knowledge may have crossed those thresholds, carried by small groups into a changed world. Not as complete systems, not as civilizations, but as pieces. To understand how this could happen, we must imagine survival at the edge. After a collapse, survivors would not be focused on preserving history. They would be focused on staying alive. Food, water, shelter, and safety would dominate every decision. Knowledge that did not directly contribute to survival would be abandoned. What remained would be whatever could still function. Practical skills, environmental awareness, basic social structures. Over time, as conditions stabilized, these fragments could be rebuilt into something new. But the memory of what came before would be distorted. Details would be lost. Context would vanish. Meaning would shift. What had once been technical knowledge might become tradition. What had once been observation might become story. What had once been lived experience might become myth. This process does not require deliberate invention. It requires time. Imagine a group that survives a collapse by retreating to a safer region. Generations later, they still tell stories of a time when the world was different, when the land extended farther, when animals behaved differently, when the sea was not where it is now. Those stories would not be records. They would be memories reshaped by repetition. As centuries pass, memory simplifies. Events compress. Causes blur. The past becomes symbolic. What remains is not accuracy, but significance. This is how survivors carry knowledge across deep time, not through writing, not through monuments, but through narrative. Myths of floods, lost lands, great winters, and world-ending fires appear in cultures separated by vast distances. These stories are often dismissed as coincidence or imagination. But coincidence becomes less convincing when patterns repeat. Flood myths appear where sea levels rose dramatically. Stories of endless winter emerge where ice once dominated. Legends of vanished lands persist near drowned coastlines. These stories do not tell us exactly what happened, but they may tell us that something happened. Survivors do not remember history the way historians do. They remember impact. They remember loss. They remember transformation. And they pass those memories forward in forms that can survive when facts cannot. This does not mean myths are literal records. It means they may be echoes, faint signals from a past that could not be preserved in any other way. The challenge for modern understanding is that these echoes are subtle. They do not announce themselves as evidence. They are mixed with imagination, belief, and later interpretation. Extracting meaning from them requires caution, but ignoring them entirely may be a mistake. If humanity has endured repeated resets, then the survivors of those events are the bridge between worlds. They are the reason the past is not completely silent. They carry fragments forward, changed, simplified, and reshaped, but still connected to something real. Understanding these survivors requires us to look beyond archaeology alone. We must consider memory, oral tradition, and the ways humans encode experience when permanence is impossible. In the next part, we will explore how ancient memory transforms over time, and why myth may be one of the few places where the forgotten age of humanity still speaks. As memory passes from generation to generation, it does not remain unchanged. It adapts. What survivors carry across a collapse is not a perfect record of the past, but a version of it shaped by necessity. Details that no longer serve a purpose fade. Elements that help explain the world endure. This is how memory survives when history cannot. In societies without writing, memory must be useful to remain alive. Stories that warn of danger persist. Stories that explain survival strategies endure. Stories that bind communities together are repeated. Everything else is forgotten. Over time, these stories shift from instruction to identity. The tale about rising waters becomes a story of a great flood. A memory of migration becomes a journey of ancestors. A warning about environmental change becomes a myth of divine punishment or renewal. From the outside, these transformations appear unreliable. Modern thinking often treats myth as fiction, separate from reality. But this view misunderstands the role myth plays in human survival. Myth is not designed to preserve facts. It is designed to preserve meaning. When survivors pass on stories, they are not trying to document timelines or measurements. They are trying to ensure that future generations understand what matters, what to fear, what to respect, and what to remember. This is why similar myths appear across cultures that never contacted one another directly. Not because they shared stories, but because they shared experiences. When sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, coastal populations around the world were forced inland. Entire landscapes disappeared. For those who lived through it, the experience would have felt absolute. The land was gone. The world had changed forever. That kind of experience demands explanation. Without science, people turned to narrative. The sea rose because something ended. The land vanished because a cycle completed. The world was renewed because the old one failed. These interpretations may not align with modern language, but they align with human psychology. They give structure to loss. In this way, survivors become storytellers, not by choice, but by necessity. Their stories compress time. Events separated by generations merge into a single narrative. Causes and effects blend. Human agency mixes with natural forces. The result is not accuracy, but coherence. And coherence is what allows memory to persist. This process also explains why fragments of knowledge appear embedded in myth. Practical observations about astronomy, seasons, or geography are woven into stories that ensure they are repeated. The tale about the stars becomes a calendar. A legend about ancestors becomes a map. A ritual becomes a way of marking time. Over centuries, the original context is lost, but the structure remains. From this perspective, survivors do not preserve civilization. They preserve continuity. They ensure that humanity does not start entirely from nothing after each reset. Even a small fragment of memory can shape the direction of future societies. It can influence where people settle, what they value, and how they interpret the world around them. This means the forgotten age of humanity may not be entirely forgotten. It may be encoded, not in stone or metal, but in culture. The challenge is that culture evolves. New meanings overlay old ones. Beliefs adapt to new environments. What began as memory becomes symbol. What began as survival becomes ceremony. Extracting the past from these layers is difficult. But difficulty does not mean impossibility. If we look carefully, patterns emerge. Recurring themes, shared warnings, similar structures across distant societies. These patterns suggest that survivors carried something forward, something important enough to repeat, even when its original meaning was no longer clear. Understanding this requires humility. We must accept that not all knowledge looks like modern knowledge, that intelligence can express itself through story as effectively as through stone, and that memory, when stripped of permanence, finds other ways to survive. The survivors of the lost age were not historians. They were bridges. They connected worlds that could not otherwise communicate across time, and because of them, the silence before history is not complete. It is broken by echoes, faint, distorted, but persistent. In the next chapter, we will examine those echoes more closely by exploring ancient myths and memories themselves, and asking what they may reveal about a world that no longer exists. When history fails, memory adapts. For most of human existence, memory did not live in books or monuments. It lived in people. It moved through voices, gestures, rituals, and stories repeated around fires and across generations. This form of memory was fragile, but it was also flexible. It could survive without stone, without writing, and without permanence. This is where myth enters the story. Modern thinking often separates myth from history, treating one as imagination and the other as fact. But for early humanity, this distinction did not exist. Myth was not a false account of the past. It was a way of carrying meaning through time when precision was impossible. To understand ancient memory, we must first understand its purpose. Myth did not exist to preserve dates, measurements, or exact sequences of events. It existed to preserve lessons. It encoded experiences in forms that could be remembered, retold, and adapted as circumstances changed. In a world shaped by uncertainty, this kind of memory was more valuable than accuracy. Consider how memory works without writing. Details fade quickly. What remains are patterns, strong impressions tied to emotion, danger, or transformation. These impressions are easier to recall and harder to erase. Over time, they become the core of a story, while surrounding details shift or disappear. A catastrophic flood becomes the memory of a world-ending deluge. A long drought becomes the anger of the land. A sudden climate shift becomes the turning of an age. The language changes, but the experience remains embedded within the story. This is why ancient myths often feel exaggerated. They compress long processes into single events. They turn gradual change into dramatic moments. They personify natural forces, not because early humans misunderstood nature, but because narrative is how the human mind organizes complexity. When survivors passed these stories forward, they were not lying. They were translating. They took experiences too large, too slow, or too abstract to explain directly, and reshaped them into forms that could be understood and remembered. A story about gods, monsters, or ancestors was not meant to be literal. It was meant to be unforgettable. This is also why similar myths appear in cultures separated by oceans and continents. Flood stories, lost lands, great winters, and cycles of destruction and renewal are found across the world. These similarities are often dismissed as coincidence or shared psychology. But coincidence becomes less convincing when the underlying experiences align with known environmental changes. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically. Coastal populations everywhere were affected. Entire regions disappeared beneath the water. For those who lived through it, the change would have been total. The land they knew vanished. Familiar routes were gone. The world was transformed. That experience demanded explanation. Without science, people turned to story. The land was lost because an age ended. The waters rose because a balance was broken. Survivors lived because something allowed them to endure. These stories were not designed to inform outsiders. They were designed to guide descendants, warning them of danger, teaching respect for forces beyond human control, and explaining why the world was the way it was. Over time, these narratives hardened into tradition. Rituals formed around them. Ceremonies marked their significance. What began as memory became identity, and identity is powerful. Once a story becomes part of who a people believe they are, it can survive for thousands of years, even when its original meaning is forgotten. This is how ancient memory can outlast civilizations, carried not by stone or text, but by belief and repetition. The challenge for modern understanding is that myth resists analysis. It does not present evidence directly. It hides information within symbolism, metaphor, and cultural context. Extracting meaning requires patience and restraint. If we approach myth expecting literal history, we will be disappointed. If we approach it expecting nonsense, we will miss what matters. But if we approach it as memory shaped by survival, something else emerges. Patterns, recurring themes, shared structures that hint at common experiences buried deep in the past. These patterns suggest that ancient myths may preserve echoes of the forgotten age of humanity, not as records, but as reflections. They show us how early humans understood loss, catastrophe, and renewal when the world changed beyond recognition. In the next part, we will look more closely at these patterns and ask a difficult question. If myth carries memory, then what exactly is it remembering? If myth carries memory, then the most important question is not whether the stories are true, it is what they are trying to remember. Across cultures, ancient myths often share a striking structure. They speak of a time before the present world, a previous age that ended in destruction. This ending is rarely gentle. It comes through flood, fire, darkness, cold, or chaos. Afterward, a smaller world remains, inhabited by survivors who must begin again.
This pattern appears too consistently to be ignored. The details change, but the structure remains. There is an old world, there is a catastrophe, there are survivors, there is renewal. This sequence mirrors what we would expect if humanity experienced repeated resets. Each reset would fracture continuity. Each recovery would begin with fewer people, less knowledge, and altered conditions. Over time, these experiences would be remembered not as history, but as cycles. In many traditions, time itself is cyclical. Ages rise and fall. Worlds are created and destroyed. Humanity forgets and relearns. This concept is often dismissed as symbolic philosophy, but it may reflect lived experience rather than abstract thought. For people who witnessed dramatic environmental change, linear progress would not feel real. What would feel real is repetition. The world was once different. Then it ended. Then it became this. Myth gives form to that experience. It also explains why ancient stories often place survivors in elevated or protected places, mountains, islands, caves, or vessels. These are symbols of refuge, but they may also reflect real survival strategies. High ground escapes floodwaters. Caves offer shelter during climate extremes. Islands can preserve populations when surrounding lands collapse. Again, myth does not preserve details. It preserves patterns, and patterns are resilient. This resilience allows memory to cross thousands of years, even as civilizations rise and fall. A story told by one culture may be absorbed by another, reshaped to fit new beliefs while retaining its core structure. Over time, the origin of the story is forgotten, but the story itself survives. This creates a challenge for modern interpretation. When we encounter ancient myths, we often ask whether they describe real events. But this question assumes that myths function like records. They do not. They function like compression, reducing vast, complex experiences into manageable narratives. 1,000 years of environmental change may become a single flood. Centuries of instability may become a war between gods. Multiple collapses may become one great ending. From this perspective, myth does not lie. It simplifies. The danger lies in taking myth either too literally or not seriously enough. Literal interpretation misses the symbolism. Dismissal misses the memory. The truth lies between. Ancient memory is not a map of the past. It is a shadow cast by it. That shadow tells us that humanity remembers loss. It remembers change. It remembers starting over. These memories persist even when the reasons behind them are no longer understood. This suggests something profound. The forgotten age of humanity may not be absent from our cultural memory. It may be embedded so deeply that we no longer recognize it as memory at all. It survives as story, ritual, and belief, fragments of experience carried across resets by survivors who could not preserve anything else. If so, then myth is not evidence of ignorance. It is evidence of endurance. It shows us how humans preserved meaning when facts could not survive. It reveals the psychological architecture of survival in a world that repeatedly erased the past. Understanding this does not require us to abandon science. It requires us to expand our definition of evidence. Archaeology shows us what lasted. Myth
shows us what mattered.
Together, they offer a more complete picture of a humanity shaped not just by progress, but by loss. In the next chapter, we will turn back to the historical record and ask why official history remains so silent about these early ages, and what that silence reveals about the limits of our understanding today. At a certain point, the question changes. It is no longer what happened in the deep past, it becomes why we know so little about it. History, as we understand it today, is not a neutral window into the past. It is a system, one shaped by evidence, methodology, and limits. Those limits determine what can be seen, what can be studied, and what is left in darkness. The silence before history is not just the absence of information, it is the boundary of the tools we use to understand the past. Modern history relies heavily on records that can be dated, verified, and compared. Writing anchors events in time. Architecture anchors societies in space. Artifacts provide context. Together, these elements allow historians to reconstruct sequences with confidence. Prehistory offers none of these guarantees. Without writing, there is no timeline, only estimates. Without cities, there are no centers, only scattered traces. Without durable materials, there is little to compare or confirm. This creates a fundamental problem. The further back we go, the more history becomes inference rather than record. Archaeology fills part of this gap, but it is not omniscient. It works with what survives. It reconstructs the past from fragments, often incomplete, often ambiguous. When evidence is sparse, interpretation becomes cautious by necessity, and caution tends to narrow focus. To be accepted, claims must be supported by multiple lines of evidence. They must fit within established frameworks. They must be reproducible and defensible. This is how science protects itself from speculation, but protection has a cost. When evidence does not fit existing models, it is often set aside, not rejected, but isolated. Without broader context, such findings remain anomalies rather than catalysts for change. Over time, this creates a self-reinforcing silence. History becomes centered on periods with abundant evidence. Civilizations with writing, monuments, and dense material culture dominate the narrative. Everything before them is compressed into a prologue, a vague prelude to real history. The result is an illusion of sudden emergence. It appears as though civilization arrives fully formed, intelligence ignites abruptly, and complexity begins almost overnight. The long, unstable, and fragmented human story that preceded it fades into obscurity. This is not because historians deny the deep past. It is because the deep past resists reconstruction. There is also a psychological factor at work. Humans prefer clear beginnings. They prefer origins that can be named, dated, and located. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. A past defined by gaps, cycles, and loss offers no firm foundation on which to build identity. Civilization provides that foundation. It offers a point of reference, a moment when the world begins to look familiar. Cities, laws, writing, and hierarchy resemble the structures we still live within today. Everything before that feels alien, distant, and difficult to integrate. So history begins where recognition begins. This does not mean that earlier humanity was insignificant. It means that significance is easier to assign when the past resembles the present. There is also the issue of scale. Small, mobile populations leave small footprints. Their impact spreads across space rather than concentrating in one place. Such patterns are harder to detect archaeologically. 1,000 people living lightly across a vast landscape may leave less evidence than a single city occupied for centuries. Silence, in this case, is not absence. It is diffusion. The forgotten age of humanity may have been spread too thin, too mobile, and too vulnerable to leave behind the kinds of traces history is designed to recognize. When resets occurred, through climate change, population collapse, or environmental upheaval,
Whatever fragile continuity existed was broken again. Each break pushed the past further from reach. By the time stability returned, only the most recent fragments remained accessible. Everything else was buried, drowned, eroded, or forgotten. This does not imply a conspiracy of silence. It implies a methodological one. History goes silent where evidence becomes unreliable, where certainty cannot be maintained, and where interpretation risks speculation. In those spaces, caution becomes quiet, and quiet becomes absence. In the next part, we will examine how this silence shapes modern understanding, and why recognizing its limits may be the key to finally hearing what the deep past has been trying to tell us. The silence of history does not mean that nothing lies beyond it. It means that our methods struggle to reach it. Modern historical understanding is shaped by a need for certainty. Claims must be grounded in evidence that can be measured, compared, and verified. This standard is necessary. It protects history from fantasy and distortion. But it also narrows what can be said. When evidence becomes sparse, history becomes cautious. When patterns are incomplete, interpretation retreats. Over time, this creates a boundary beyond which historians rarely venture, not because the past does not exist there, but because it cannot be described with confidence. This boundary is where prehistory begins. Beyond it, the past becomes fragmented. Timelines blur, events overlap, cause and effect lose clarity. What remains are traces without narrative, signals without context. Faced with this uncertainty, history often chooses silence. This choice is not malicious, it is pragmatic. To speak without sufficient evidence risks error. To speculate risks credibility. And so the deep past is often reduced to brief summaries, cautious language, and unresolved questions. Yet silence has consequences. When large portions of human existence are left unexplored, assumptions fill the gaps. We begin to treat civilization as the default state of intelligence, rather than one expression among many. We imagine progress as inevitable rather than fragile. We forget how often knowledge has been lost, not because it was wrong, but because it could not survive instability. This shapes how we understand ourselves. If history begins with civilization, then everything before it appears primitive by comparison. The absence of cities becomes the absence of culture. The lack of writing becomes the lack of thought. The silence becomes interpreted as emptiness. But emptiness is a conclusion, not an observation. The forgotten age of humanity challenges this conclusion. It suggests that intelligence, culture, and complexity may have existed long before they left durable marks. It implies that what we call history may be a narrow slice of a much longer, more turbulent story. Recognizing this does not undermine science. It strengthens it. Science advances by questioning its own limits. When evidence is missing, the honest response is not dismissal, but curiosity. Why is the evidence missing? What conditions would erase it? What forms of intelligence might leave no trace? These questions do not demand immediate answers. They demand openness. The silence of history may be telling us something important, not about the absence of the past, but about the fragility of memory. It reminds us that survival does not guarantee remembrance, and that knowledge can vanish as easily as it forms. This understanding reframes how we interpret both archaeology and myth. Instead of seeing them as competing explanations, we can see them as complementary. Archaeology shows us what survived materially. Myth shows us what survived psychologically. Between them lies a fuller picture of humanity, one shaped not just by growth, but by loss, not just by achievement, but by endurance. The silence before history is not a wall. It is a threshold. Crossing it requires accepting uncertainty, resisting the urge for simple origins. and acknowledging that the human story may be defined as much by what was erased as by what was preserved. When we listen to the silence carefully, it does not remain empty. It becomes a question, and questions are where understanding begins. In the final chapter, we will step back from the deep past and consider what the forgotten age of humanity means for us today, how recognizing cycles of loss and recovery changes the way we view civilization, progress, and our place in history. The forgotten age of humanity does not belong only to the past. It reaches forward. What we choose to remember or ignore about our deep history shapes how we understand the present. It influences how we define progress, how we measure intelligence, and how confident we feel about the permanence of our world. Modern civilization often sees itself as the culmination of human development. Technology advances, knowledge accumulates. The future is assumed to be an extension of the present, larger, faster, more complex. But the forgotten age tells a different story. It suggests that intelligence is not new, that adaptation is not linear, that progress is not guaranteed. For most of human existence, survival mattered more than legacy. Knowledge was valuable only as long as it could be used. When conditions changed, even the most refined understanding could become irrelevant overnight. This reality forces us to reconsider what advancement truly means. Civilization excels at building structures that endure. Roads, cities, institutions, and digital networks extend human influence far beyond individual lifespans. But this endurance depends on stability. Climate stability, ecological stability, social stability. The forgotten age reminds us that stability is rare. For hundreds of thousands of years, the world shifted faster than culture could adapt. When that happened, intelligence did not disappear. It narrowed. It focused inward. It prioritized survival over expansion. From this perspective, modern civilization is not the natural state of humanity. It is a moment made possible by an unusually calm period in Earth's history. This does not diminish modern achievements, but it places them in context. If the past is defined by cycles of growth and collapse, then the present is not immune. Our technologies are powerful, but they are also dependent. Our knowledge is vast, but it is fragile. Digital memory feels permanent, yet it relies on systems that require constant maintenance. The forgotten age asks an uncomfortable question. What would survive if our systems failed? What knowledge would endure without electricity, without networks, without institutions to protect it? Early humanity faced this question repeatedly. They survived not by preserving everything, but by preserving what mattered most. Skills that could be carried, knowledge that could be taught, social bonds that could adapt to new conditions. This kind of resilience does not produce monuments. It produces continuity. Understanding this challenges the way we think about intelligence. Intelligence is not defined by what it builds, but by how it responds to change. A civilization that cannot adapt is not advanced. It is vulnerable. The forgotten age of humanity may therefore offer lessons that modern society has forgotten. It reminds us that flexibility can be more valuable than complexity, that redundancy can be more important than efficiency, that knowledge stored only in external systems is always at risk. It also reminds us that loss is not failure. Loss is part of the human story. Entire worlds may have risen and fallen without leaving a trace, not because they were insignificant, but because the conditions of their existence did not allow permanence. Their intelligence was real. Their lives mattered. Their disappearance does not erase their contribution to what humanity eventually became. In this sense, the forgotten age is not a warning about the past. It is a mirror held up to the present. It asks us to consider whether we are building a civilization that can endure change, or one that assumes change will never come. In the final part, we will step back one last time and reflect on the meaning of this silence, why it persists, why it matters, and what it tells us about humanity's place in a world that has never stopped changing. The silence before history is unsettling because it resists closure. There is no single answer hidden within it, no lost city waiting to be uncovered, no final revelation that resolves every question. And perhaps that is the point. The forgotten age of humanity is not a mystery meant to be solved once and for all. It is a reminder of limits, of what time erases, of what survival does not preserve, and of how fragile memory truly is. When we look back into the deep past, we are not simply searching for origins. We are confronting impermanence. Human intelligence did not emerge to leave a record. It emerged to endure. For most of our existence, endurance required adaptation, movement, and restraint. What survived was not what was most impressive, but what was most resilient. Civilization reversed that priority. It rewarded permanence. It rewarded accumulation. It rewarded visibility. In doing so, it made history possible, but it also made history selective. What we remember is shaped by what could survive the longest, not by what mattered most at the time. This is why the forgotten age remains silent, not because it lacked meaning, but because its meaning was carried in forms that could not outlast the world that shaped them. Understanding this changes how we interpret the past. It urges caution when drawing sharp lines between primitive and advanced. It reminds us that intelligence adapts to context, and that what appears simple from one perspective may be sophisticated from another. It also challenges the idea that progress is irreversible. Human history, viewed across deep time, is not a straight path forward. It is a pattern of movement, forward, backward, sideways, guided by forces both within and beyond human control. Knowledge rises, falls, and rises again, shaped by environments that do not negotiate. The forgotten age teaches us humility. It shows that humanity has faced existential uncertainty before and survived. Not by dominating the world, but by learning to live within its limits. That survival did not require monuments or records. It required awareness, cooperation, and adaptability. These qualities are not relics of the past. They are necessities of the future. As modern civilization grows more complex, it also grows more dependent. Systems become interconnected. Failures cascade. The margin for error narrows. In such a world, the lessons of resilience, so deeply embedded in the forgotten age, become increasingly relevant. What knowledge would we carry forward if forced to start again? What skills would matter when permanence fails? What values would endure when structures collapse? These are not abstract questions. They are echoes of questions humanity has answered many times before. The silence before history does not accuse us of ignorance. It invites us to listen more carefully, to the limits of evidence, to the fragility of memory, and to the patterns that repeat when conditions change. It reminds us that history is not the full measure of humanity. Much of what we are was shaped long before the first word was written, long before the first city rose, long before memory learned to anchor itself in stone. That legacy is invisible, but it is not absent. It lives in how humans respond to uncertainty, in how communities form under pressure, in how intelligence adapts when the world becomes unstable. The forgotten age of humanity may never be fully recovered, but it does not need to be. Its value lies not in what it reveals about the past, but in what it reveals about us. We are not the first to face change. We are not the first to rebuild, and we are not the first to forget. The silence before history is not empty. It is full of lives lived, worlds lost, and lessons learned. Lessons that continue to shape humanity even when we no longer remember their origin. And perhaps that is the most human truth of all.